Hi, this is Julia Walker with Grey Duck Forge, and today we're going to be talking about hoof growth, specifically with regards to keratinization, and we'll also briefly talk about keratomas just because they are related. So let's dig in. I'm going to try and keep this from getting complicated. I want to make this as understandable as possible when we're talking biology type subjects. It's hard to read about it in a way that makes sense, so I'm going to try and make it visual with the skills that I have, and I'm not capable of doing like good visualizations, but I'm going to try and draw things for you so you can kind of understand and stick to the same words so that if I'm using a technical term, I'm at least using the same one every time, and try and get a description here that makes sense. So put on your science hats and let's go. First things first, I'm going to start with like how we get into this. So as farriers, you pick up a foot, there's a lot of hoof there. Wow, he grew a lot, right? What we're looking at is kind of the sum of all the inputs, the cellular production at the coronary band is, the input, but, if there's circulation issues, that could be a factor in what we're seeing. If they're wearing their feet away faster than they're growing it, that could be a factor, or if they're pawing their toes off. So basically, at that coronary corium, provided there's nothing wrong, cells are being produced at a pretty consistent rate. If there are issues with blood supply, like frozen hooves in winter, which we see here in Minnesota all the time, or if a horse has laminitis, if you ever see a venogram of that, you'll see circulation isn't really happening kind of in that toe area, and so there's going to be a disruption to cellular production there. So cells being produced is, that one part, where the hoof material can also compress some, kind of like your toes of your club foot, and that's before there's any circulation things figured out. But basically what we're looking at is kind of growth for a farrier is the cells that are being produced at the coronary band minus any amount of wear, and then minus any amount of squishing, or throw circulation in with the squishing thing, cellular circulation issues related. So cellular production, keratinization, we're just going to run through how this actually works at a cellular level. So the coronary corium is made up of the papilla and the flesh in between them. Easy peasy. When you do a dissection, you can see that corium. And that corium is also like kind of that exterior layer of it is what is referred to as the stratum germinavatum. And that is the layer of cells where the stuff grows off of. And the stuff that grows off of that layer of like very much alive cells and permanently alive cells are cells that are called keratinocytes. That's one of the very few big words that we're going to use. But those cells are grown for the purpose of dying off, and when they are dead, their like skeleton is what horn is. So it's like the skeleton of a once alive cell that was born like specifically to die to turn into horn. And that process of that cell dying off is called keratinization. So the keratinocytes that are grown from the papilla become tubular horn. The ones that are grown from the spaces between the papilla become that intertubular horn, and I'll kind of give you I'll show you kind of how that works, because it visually does make sense, which is helpful. But those cells themselves dying also need to be stuck to each other, or else it's just a bunch of flub. Flub being what happens with a keratoma. So desmosomes are tiny little doohickeys, that's all we need to know, and they form connections between the partially keratinized cells. Sorry, pronunciation is tricky with these words, but the desmosomes connect the partially keratinized cells, and then alongside keratin tonofilaments lock everything together in 3D. And that is how we get like hoof material. So the cells, the keratinocyte cells dry and flatten out, and they become dead when the cell's nucleus dies. And that is how we know that horn itself is dead. The hoof wall grows out as new keratinocytes are produced off of that stratum germinatum, off of those cells. And when they are making new cells, they kind of bump down the old dead cells. And that is how the hoof wall descends from the coronary band. So, to draw it, you've got your layer of cells that are healthy, living cells, the stuff that, that exterior layer of the coronary corium, up at that coronary band, that you can see when you do a dissection. So, and these cells, they all have their nucleus like you would have in biology class. They're happy and healthy, and they're chilling, and they've got water in them, and their blood kind of flows into them, and then, stuff leaves, and they're happy and healthy. Well, something that they can do, which is kind of cool, is they can produce a keratinocyte cell with its own happy little nucleus. And so these guys are all growing their keratinocyte cells, and they're just chilling. And as time goes on, your keratinocyte cell becomes a little flatter, and flatter, and flatter until it's dead. And then as that happens, the cells need to become smushed together. And my drawing is, this is the version that we're following here. But they become smushed together and linked, and these little scribbles, these bright red scribbles that I'm doing, that is going to be your desmosome. And that's the little doohickey that sticks these cells together. Now, then, as they flatten out even more, which and they're all stuck together, then they're also producing keratin tonofilaments in these directions, like filling a water bottle with Equilox, or a water balloon with Equilox, since we're farriers. But if it was also drying out at the same time and shriveling up, kind of a complicated idea, but solidifying itself on the inside. And this nucleus is about to die. And when it dies, everything's dried out. It's full of this keratin tonofilaments holding everything together. And this one's full of tonofilaments. And this one's full of tonofilaments. And they are rock hard, and they're flattened out like this. And that's from the base layer, that's the direction that they flatten out. And that's all you need to know. Keratin, I'll label this tonofilaments, and then these here are your keratinocytes. Yay. Diagram, that's how it happens, and that's it. And so horn are just, this is kind of like, that's your hoof material. That's what it's made out of. And this all happens in a really small space up by that, off of that coronary corium. So, tubular horn and intertubular horn start off as the same type of cells, those keratinocyte cells. They're just grown in different directions and linked together into different structures. So, tubular horn grows off the sides of the papilla, and so it's facing kind of sideways or perpendicular to the it'll be hard to describe it here, but so tubular horn is kind of growing off the sides of the papilla, so it's sideways. Intertubular horn is growing off the flat spaces in between, so it's kind of facing downwards. And the same basic, they're the same basic cell structure, they're just pointed in different directions. Tubular horn provides stiffness, intertubular horn does the toughness bit. Intertubular horn is also more greatly affected by water absorption for some reason, so let's draw it. Here's your papilla and your spaces in between the papilla that make up your coronary corium, so this is all alive stuff. And then along this corium, these are supposed to be that stratum germinatum type. That last layer of cells that are growing are keratinocyte cells. And they're going all the way around, and there we go. Something like that. Left side is more accurate, right side is I got tired. Okay, so these guys are growing cells that are flattening out in this direction. And you can see how when they grow out this direction, that this kind of forms this general cylinder shape, right? The tubules. Whereas these guys, they're flattening off this way. And you can see how this kind of forms like the glue between the tubules. So as they're growing off, you're getting tubules off of this, off of each papilla. And depending on how big the papilla is, you know, you might get a wider tubule or a thicker tubule. You know, the dimensions of the papilla can grow different dimension tubes. Versus like a really skinny one would grow like a really small tube. So that's kind of fun. And then the spaces in between is just stuff that's locking them together. And how big the spaces are in between would tell you how far apart the tubules are. So that's how it works. We know in the hoof wall itself, this is a really good diagram from The Hoof of the Horse by Dr. Simon Curtis. So enjoy. But here are your lamina. And as you go from that innermost layer to the pretty inner layer to this kind of intermediate layer to the like outermost layer, you can see there's different, you know, that's probably a really big papilla, whereas this one here is probably a little papilla. These are maybe a little more compressed towards the outside, whereas these are pretty swelled up and whatever. And this inner layer is kind of fun. They're like really densely packed, kind of varying sizes, but very densely packed, whereas these are not very densely packed. There's a lot of that intertubular horns space in between. Just kind of cool. But it's all the same stuff, just pumped out by different shaped papilla with different papilla densities and whatnot. So kind of cool. Hoof growth rates, there's a certification topic. In Butler's book, which is the one that's referenced on certification exams, 3/8 of an inch per month. That's burn that into your brain. You know, in my experience, I would say that the one in The Hoof of the Horse that Dr. Curtis stated with all his sources, something closer to 1/4 of an inch or 6.4 millimeters if you're European, per month. I'd say that's probably closer. But it really depends, right? It depends on, is the horse foundered? Is it winter? Are there, you know, is it walking around at all? Is it a foundered pony? Like, or just a pony in general, because they're all mutants. So, you know, it varies truly. That's the most valid answer. But if you're going to certification and you need to know something, 3/8 of an inch, that is what you should know. So what's a keratoma? What is a keratoma? It's a blob of garbage, is what it is. Underdeveloped horn cells. So something in that keratinization process went wrong. They have oniony layers on the inside. That's a fun fact. And there are generally two types, cylindrical and spherical. Now, to be fair, keratomas are all blobs, and they're all unique kind of blobby shapes, but they're generally pretty round. The cylindrical ones are also like pretty round, but they're called cylindrical because as they grow down from the coronary band and work their way down the hoof wall, in that stratum medium layer, they are scraping away at P3 as they go down in a process that's referred to as pressure resorption, which I'm pretty sure if you use the phrase pressure resorption while you're working for somebody, you're technically allowed to raise your rates. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure. And that scraped away spot in the coffin bone that they leave behind is like a dark cone that shows up on an x-ray. And that's the cylinder that they're referring to. So it's the size, the shape of the keratoma is the same. It just leaves behind a kind of track in the coffin bone, and that's what they're referring to. Spherical ones, that's generally going to be something that you find in the sole. So it didn't scrape away anything on the way down. It just kind of showed up and hurt everybody and had to be ripped out. Because they do have to be removed, either surgically or it's pretty much surgery every time. Sometimes they just kind of fall out while you're trimming if you're lucky, but don't plan on being lucky. So wall keratomas are frequently kind of up towards like the front half of the foot. They tend to be in this region, whereas sole keratomas are frequently in the back half of the foot in that region, but not always, you know, frequently, not always. asterisk, asterisk, etc. They're kind of most commonly diagnosed with X-rays, and they can be, but sometimes it's really hard to see because of what shows up in an X-ray, which is like bone. And keratomas are not bone; they are globs of hoof wall. So sometimes you can see like a chunk that's missing in the bone, but otherwise, something like an MRI or a CT scan might be a little bit more helpful to actually see what's going on, so that the angle that you're taking the X-ray at isn't going to be like the reason why you missed a keratoma. So cylindrical keratoma, something that you might be able to see on an X-ray, is like a chunk that was taken out, and depending on the angle, sometimes you can like see like the space that was bored out of that coffin bone via pressure resorption. Make sure to use that at work. Otherwise, spherical keratoma. This is a pretty awesome picture that I stole off the internet. I stole both of these. That's why they're so grainy. This one is, obviously not like a perfect sphere, but yeah, kind of coming off that. Okay, don't judge how much of a half of a foot that is, but, kind of like, it's not up here anyway, so we'll call it, like, kind of towards the heel area. But that's more something that you'd be able to pull out of the sole. So if you haven't seen a lot of them, like, these are MRIs, and here's your keratoma, versus this is a CT, and that's where the keratoma ruined a bunch of stuff. So multiple ways of looking at things. You can kind of see how both of these would be pretty darn helpful in figuring out where a thing is and what it's affecting and what's wrong. So, to summarize, keratinization, easy, right? In and out, totally not technically dense, totally not confusing. Keratinization itself, we're talking hoof material is formed by the chorea on that stratum germinativum layer, but that outside layer of the corium, and that layer grows those keratinocyte cells, which are then processed into tubular or intertubular horn as they die off. They are locked in place by desmosome binders and the keratin tonofilaments that are inside of the cells. And that's it. And now you have a visualization to go with that, and you're not just going off a paragraph describing how it works. Cool. How farriers look at growth is a sum of all the inputs. So growth rate is production minus wear minus compression or circulation effects. Two separate things, but we'll just throw it into one. Foals, interestingly enough, also grow their hooves outward at the coronary band, not just downward. I totally had a slide about that and removed it because it felt like too much, but they do. Fun fact. And that's because their papilla increase in number, the spaces between them get bigger, and the papilla themselves also get bigger. 3 things that have been scientifically proven about why their feet go from this shape to this shape and then back to this shape. Hopefully your foal's hooves never look like any of those pictures, but you get the idea. As time goes on, they get bigger up top because the coronary chorea is growing, and it grows in those 3 ways. And then keratomas are disorganized hoof material that ruins everything until it is surgically removed, and can be in the stratum medium of the wall or in the sole. And X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans are how to detect them. And that's it. So thank you for joining me on this bushwhacking through keratinization and hoof growth and keratomas, just for funsies. If I misrepresented anything about this, or you have a problem with something that I said, fight me. I'm just kidding. Let me know in the comments if there are any corrections that you think I should make. And I'm happy to chat and discuss if you have any questions, whatever. Otherwise, stay tuned for more certification-based study videos. This is a little more technically dense than average, but hopefully the details will help flesh out your understanding of how it works, so that when you're trying to imagine it in the future, you have something to hold on to and not just like a vague, really long scientific word that is scary. So hopefully it's not like scary anymore, or at least you have like an image to like burn into your brain. So cool. Thanks for joining me. And yeah, stay tuned.